The rain came down in sheets that February. Morning in 2026. Cold, relentless. The kind of rain that soaks through wool and settles into bone outside Buckingham Palace. A young royal guard stood motionless, his red tunic darkened by water, his bearskin hat heavy with moisture. Tourists hurried past under umbrellas, phones out, snapping photos of the soldier who wouldn't move, wouldn't blink, wouldn't break. His name was Thomas Reed, 23 years old, 3 years in service. And on this particular morning, carried a secret that made his chest tight beneath the ceremonial uniform. The news had broken just hours before his shift. Medical sources, palace statements, words that felt unreal even as they spread across every screen in Britain. The king's cancer had returned. Thomas had reported for duty anyway, because that's what a guardsman does. But standing there in the rain, rifle at his side, he felt something shift inside him. A question he couldn't shake. What does loyalty mean when the person you're protecting is mortal? Fragile, fighting a battle no crown can win. If you're moved by stories of duty, honor, and the quiet strength of ordinary people in extraordinary moments, stay with us. You won't want to miss what happens next. Inside the palace, life moved with controlled urgency. Staff whispered in hallways. Phones rang in private offices. The machinery of monarchy adapted, as it always had, to crisis. But King Charles III was not hiding. At 77, he had already survived one cancer diagnosis. Months of treatment in 2024, the world watching, waiting, hoping. He had returned to duty then. Thinner but determined, his eyes carrying the weight of borrowed time. Now, in early 2026, the disease had come back. Quietly, without fanfare. A routine scan. A doctor's careful words. A choice to make. He could step back. Rest. Let his son assume more responsibilities. The palace would understand. The people would understand. But Charles had spent his entire life waiting to serve as king. 7 decades as heir. He would not spend what remained as a patient. Scheduled a visit to Manchester, he told his private secretary that morning. As planned, secretary hesitated. Your Majesty, perhaps we should, as planned, Charles repeated. Gentle, but firm. The voice of a man who had made his decision. Outside, Thomas shifted his weight imperceptibly. A movement so small, only another guardsman would notice. His feet ached. The rain ran down his neck. But he remained. He thought about his grandfather. A coal miner, dead at 62 from lung disease. His grandfather had worked until the month he died. Said a man's value was in showing up. In doing the work? In standing when standing mattered. Thomas had joined the guard to honor that. To stand for something larger than himself. Now, the man he stood for was fighting for his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, young and strong. Protecting a king who couldn't protect himself from the cells betraying his own body. A tourist approached. American accent. Excuse me, do you know if the king is okay? We heard the news. Thomas stared ahead, silent, unmoved. The way he was trained. But inside he wondered the same thing. Was the king okay? Would he be okay? And what would it mean for Britain if he wasn't? The rain continued to fall. Thomas continued to stand. And somewhere inside those ancient palace walls, a king prepared to show his people what courage looked like when everything was at stake. Asterisk, asterisk, 3 days later. Thomas found himself in Manchester, not on ceremonial duty this time, but as part of the security detail for a royal visit that half the palace staff had begged the king to cancel. The king had refused. The people need to see their monarch, he had said. Especially now. Thomas watched from his position near the entrance of the children's hospital. The crowd was thick. Hundreds of people. Some held signs. We love you, Charles. Stay strong, Your Majesty. Others simply stood in silence, tears on their faces. They had come to see a dying king, though no one would say it that way. The royal car arrived. Thomas straightened. The door opened. King Charles stepped out, and the crowd gasped. He looked smaller than Thomas remembered. The suit hung differently on his frame. His face was thinner, the skin almost translucent in the gray afternoon light. But his eyes were steady. He smiled at the crowd. Not the practiced smile of a politician. Something more real. More human. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Thank you for caring." An elderly woman in the front row began to cry. Charles walked directly to her, took her hand. Now, he said gently. "I'm not gone yet." The woman laughed through her tears. The crowd seemed to exhale as one. Thomas felt something catch in his throat. This was not a king hiding from his mortality. This was a man walking straight into it, hand outstretched, still trying to comfort others. Inside the hospital, Charles moved from room to room. Children with cancer, parents exhausted from months of treatment, nurses working doubles. He sat with each family, asked questions, listened. In one room, a 7-year-old girl named Ella lay, connected to machines, bald from chemotherapy. Her mother stood by the window, arms crossed tight against her chest. Charles approached the bed. Ella looked up at him with eyes too old for her small face. "Are you really the king?" she asked. "I really am," Charles said, settling carefully into the chair beside her bed. "My mom says you're sick too." The machines beeped. The mother turned, apology forming on her lips. But Charles smiled. "Your mom is right. I am sick too." Ella considered this. "Are you scared?" The question hung in the air. Outside the room, Thomas could hear it from his position in the hallway. He found himself leaning closer, wanting to hear the answer. Charles took a long breath. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, honest. "Sometimes," he said. "But then, I remember all the brave people fighting alongside me. People like you, Ella, and that makes me braver." Ella reached out her small hand. Charles took it. "We can be brave together," she said. "Yes," Charles whispered. "Together." Thomas had to look away. He had stood guard through ceremonies and state dinners, had maintained composure through protests and crowds, but this small moment of shared humanity threatened to undo him. After 30 minutes, the king's private secretary appeared. Time to move on. Schedule to keep. Charles stood slowly, touched Ella's hand one more time. "Keep fighting, brave one." As he left the room, his step faltered. Just for a second. His hand reached for the door frame. Thomas moved instinctively, ready to assist, but Charles steadied himself, straightened his shoulders, continued walking. In the car afterward, Thomas heard the private secretary speaking quietly. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should cut the visit short. Return to London." Through the window, Thomas could see Charles's reflection, the exhaustion written across his features. The cost of every smile, every handshake, every moment of strength for others. "No," Charles said. "There's a veterans' home on the schedule. They're expecting me." "Sir, with respect, they're expecting me," Charles repeated. Firmer now, Thomas understood then. This wasn't about duty in the abstract. This wasn't about maintaining appearances or royal protocol. This was a man racing against time, trying to give everything he had while he still had anything to give. The car pulled away from the hospital. Thomas watched the building disappear, thought of Ella in her bed, of Charles sitting beside her. Two people fighting the same enemy, one with a crown, one with a teddy bear, both refusing to surrender and outside. Standing in the rain or riding in motorcades, people like Thomas bore witness, held the space, stood guard over something more fragile and more powerful than any palace, the human will to matter. To show up even when showing up is the hardest thing in the world, asterisk, asterisk. The veterans' home smelled of old books and tea. Thomas stood in the common room, watching elderly men and women arrange themselves in chairs. Most were in their 80s, some in wheelchairs. All had served Britain in wars that were now history lessons. They sat straighter when they heard the king was coming. Adjusted medals pinned to cardigans and blazers. Smoothed hair gone white decades ago. Didn't have to come, one man muttered. Former RAF pilot. His hand shook with age, not with what he's going through. That's exactly why he came, a woman beside him said. Navy veteran. Her eyes sharp despite her years. He knows what it means to fight when the odds are against you. The king arrived 20 minutes later than scheduled. Thomas noticed the slight drag in his step, the way he gripped the handrail coming up the entrance ramp. But when Charles entered the common room, his face was warm. Open, asterisk, asterisk, thank you for your service, he said to the room. All of you. Britain stands because you stood first. An old soldier in the back began to cry. Quiet tears down weathered cheeks. Charles went to him first. Oh, what's your name? The king asked, kneeling beside the wheelchair. Robert Hughes, Your Majesty. Burma, 1944. Tell me about Burma, Charles said, and Robert did. For 10 minutes, he spoke of jungle heat and malaria and friends lost to bullets and disease. Charles listened to every word, asked questions, remembered names of battles that most people had forgotten. Thomas watched in wonder. The king was exhausted. Anyone could see it. The slump in his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. The way he had to concentrate to stand from each chair. But he gave every person in that room his full attention. Made each veteran feel seen, heard, valued. He's doing it again, the private secretary whispered to another staff member near Thomas. Pushing himself too hard? Should we intervene? Have you ever tried to stop him when he's made up his mind? They hadn't. Because this wasn't recklessness. This was purpose. After an hour, Charles sat down heavily in an armchair. A veteran named Margaret brought him tea, her hands steady despite her 90 years. You should rest, love, she said. The informality would have shocked protocol officers. But Charles smiled. I rest enough, he said. I want to be here. With people who understand. Understand what? Margaret asked. Charles looked around the room. At faces marked by time and service. At bodies that had given everything for their country and now lived in the slow fade of age. That life isn't about how long you have, he said quietly. It's about what you do with the time you're given. Margaret nodded, patted his hand. You're doing good, dear. You're doing good. Outside, the February sky had darkened. Thomas checked his watch. They were 2 hours behind schedule. The drive back to London would be long. But when the private secretary approached the king, Charles waved him off. Not yet, he said. There's someone else I need to meet. He meant a veteran named James, 94, too ill to come to the common room, bedridden on the home's second floor. The staff exchanged glances, the king climbing stairs in his condition. But Charles was already moving toward the elevator. Upstairs, James lay in a small room overlooking a garden. His breathing was labored. His daughter sat beside him, holding his hand. She stood when the king entered, shock on her face. Please sit, Charles said. I'm here for your father. He moved to the bedside. James's eyes opened, cloudy with age and sickness. Your Majesty, James whispered. I heard you served in Korea, Charles said, pulling a chair close. I wanted to thank you personally. For 20 minutes, the king sat with a dying veteran in a small room far from palaces and power. They spoke of service and sacrifice, of cold Korean winters and the friends James still missed 7 decades later. Thomas stood guard outside the door. He could hear the murmur of voices, could hear James laugh once, a sound like paper rustling. When Charles finally emerged, his eyes were red. The daughter followed him out. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. You didn't have to do this. Charles took her hands in his. Yes, he said. I did. In the car back to London, Charles said nothing. He stared out the window at the passing countryside, lights from towns and villages blinking in the darkness. Thomas sat in the front seat, part of the security detail. He watched the king's reflection in the rearview mirror. Charles looked like a man who had run a marathon, drained, spent, but somehow at peace. The private secretary worked on his phone, rescheduling tomorrow's appointments, trying to clear space for rest, but Thomas knew there would be no rest. Not really. Because the king had made a choice, to spend his remaining energy not on himself, but on others. To use his illness not as an excuse to withdraw, but as a reason to connect. To show that even in dying, a person could choose how to live. The car hummed through the night. Thomas thought of Ella in her hospital bed, of Robert crying in the common room, of James in his small room, breathing his last breaths, blessed by a visit from a king who understood what it meant to fight a battle you couldn't win. And he thought of himself, young, healthy, standing guard. What was he guarding, really? Not just a building, not just a person. Something bigger. Something that made people stand straighter. Made them remember their worth. Made them believe that service and sacrifice still mattered in a world that often forgot. Asterisk. 2 weeks passed. The palace released carefully worded statements. The king was continuing treatment. The king was maintaining his schedule where possible. The king was grateful for the public's support. What they didn't say was visible to anyone who looked closely. King Charles was fading. Thomas saw it every time he stood guard. The king's walks through the palace gardens grew shorter. His meetings ended earlier. Some mornings, he didn't emerge from his private quarters until noon, but still, he refused to stop. On a cold March morning, Thomas was assigned to Windsor Castle. The king was scheduled to meet with a group of young activists, climate change advocates, teenagers who had written to him for years. The staff had tried to cancel, reschedule, but Charles insisted. They've been patient with me their whole lives, he said. First waiting for me to become king, now waiting for me to stay alive long enough to meet them. I won't make them wait any longer. Thomas stood outside the meeting room. Through the door, he could hear voices, young, passionate, talking about ocean temperatures and carbon, missions and futures they were desperate to protect, and he could hear the king asking questions, challenging ideas gently, sharing his own decades of environmental advocacy. I've been called a lot of things for caring about the planet, Charles said at one point, his voice tired but warm, mad, eccentric, out of touch. But I never stopped believing that we have a responsibility to the future. 2 people not yet born. A girl's voice. 16? Maybe 17? Do you think we can still save it? The planet. Silence. A long pause. I think Charles said slowly that we have to try, even when it feels hopeless, especially when it feels hopeless, because the alternative is surrender. And I've never been very good at surrendering. When the meeting ended, the teenagers filed out. Several had tears in their eyes. One boy stopped near Thomas. That was the most important hour of my life, he said to no one in particular. He really listened. He really cared. Thomas watched them go. Watched how they carried themselves differently now. Taller, more determined. One conversation. One dying king giving time he didn't have to spare. And lives changed. Later that afternoon, Thomas was reassigned to Buckingham Palace. A sudden shift in schedule. He arrived to find the palace in quiet chaos. The king had collapsed. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet fall in his private study. He had stood up from his desk too quickly. His legs had given out. The doctor was with him now. The Prince of Wales was on his way from Scotland. The machinery of succession, never far from anyone's mind, suddenly felt very close. Thomas stood at his post in the corridor outside the king's quarters. Other guards joined him. They stood in silence, waiting. Inside, voices rose and fell. The doctor, the private secretary, and Charles's voice, weaker than before, but still stubborn. I just need a moment. Your Majesty, you need to rest. Properly rest. No engagements for at least a week. There's a school opening in Birmingham tomorrow. I promised the headmistress. Sir, please, I promised. Thomas closed his eyes. He had heard stories about his grandfather's final months, how the old man had insisted on working in the garden even when he could barely stand, how he had fixed a neighbor's fence 3 days before he died. A man finishes what he starts. His grandfather had said, now here was a king, refusing to surrender to the same instinct. The Prince of Wales arrived an hour later. Thomas saw him enter the king's quarters. Worry etched on his face. Father and son spoke for a long time. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but he heard the tone: concern, love, frustration. When the prince finally emerged, he looked older, the weight of what was coming settling on his shoulders. He paused near Thomas. For a moment, the future king and the young guard stood in the corridor together. "He won't stop," the prince said quietly. Not to Thomas specifically, just speaking the truth aloud. "I've asked him, begged him, but he won't stop." Thomas didn't respond. Couldn't respond. He was on duty. But the prince seemed to understand. He nodded once, then walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Inside the room, Charles sat by the window. His doctor had left. His staff had retreated. He was alone with his thoughts and the failing body that carried them. He looked out at London, the city he had known his entire life, the kingdom he had waited 70 years to serve. How much time did he have left? Months? Weeks? It didn't matter. Not really, because he had finally understood what his mother had known, what every monarch before him had learned. The crown wasn't about power. It wasn't about palaces or ceremonies or anything the public saw. It was about showing up, about being present, about giving whatever you had for as long as you had it to people who needed to see that their lives mattered, even now, especially now. When his own life was slipping away, he would not spend his final days in bed, would not retreat into comfort and privacy. He would stand, would serve, would show his people that dignity wasn't about strength. It was about choosing how you face the end. And Charles had made his choice. Outside his window, the sun was setting over London. The sky turned gold and purple and deep blue. Lights began to blink on across the city. Millions of lives, each one mattering, each one worth serving. Thomas stood in the corridor, silent, loyal, bearing witness to a king who refused to quit. And somewhere in Birmingham, a headmistress checked the schedule for tomorrow's school opening, hoping the king would be well enough to come. He would be. Somehow he would be, because a promise was a promise. And Charles kept his promises. The school in Birmingham was brand new, fresh paint, unmarked floors, the smell of possibility. 300 students waited in the assembly hall. Children from one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, many from immigrant families, some from homes where English was a second language. This school was their chance, their way forward, and King Charles was coming to open it. Thomas arrived 2 hours early with the security team. They swept the building, checked exits, established protocols. But Thomas kept thinking about the king's collapse 2 days before, about the doctor's warnings, about how Charles had barely eaten breakfast that morning, his hand shaking as he tried to drink his tea. This was madness. The king should be in hospital, should be resting, should be preparing for what was coming. Instead, he was on his way to Birmingham to cut a ribbon for children he'd never met. The motorcade arrived at exactly 10 a.m. Thomas watched the king emerge from the car. It took him longer than before, his movements careful, calculated. Each step a small victory over the body. It's betraying him. But when he saw the children lining the entrance, their faces bright with excitement, Charles smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes. "Look at all of you," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Ready to change the world." The headmistress met him at the door, Mrs. Okonkwo, a woman who had fought for 5 years to get this school built, who had knocked on doors and written letters and refused to give up. She took one look at the king, and her eyes filled with tears. "You came," she whispered. "I promised," Charles said simply. Inside, the assembly hall erupted in cheers when the king entered. 300 children on their feet, clapping, some crying, others just staring in wonder. Charles moved slowly through the crowd, shaking hands, asking names, listening to stories about where children came from and what they hoped to become. A 10-year-old girl named Amara told him she wanted to be a doctor. "And you will be," Charles said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." A boy named Hassan said he wanted to design buildings. The world needs good architects, Charles replied. People who build things that last. Thomas watched from his position near the stage. He saw what the cameras wouldn't capture. The moments when the king had to steady himself against a chair, when he closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength, when his breath came shorter, faster, but he also saw something else. The way Charles lit up with each child's story, the way he seemed to draw energy from their hope, as if their futures were fuel for his fading present. When it came time for the speech, Charles stood at the podium. The hall fell silent. He looked out at 300 faces, brown and black and white, young and full of potential, waiting for words from a dying king. "I won't be here to see what you become," Charles began. The honesty stunned the room. Adults shifted uncomfortably. Children stared. "I won't know if Amara becomes a doctor, if Hassan designs beautiful buildings, if any of you achieve the dreams you carry today." He paused, gripped the podium. "But I know this. You matter. Every single one of you. Your dreams matter. Your futures matter. And this school, this beautiful school that Mrs. Okonkwo fought so hard to build, matters because you matter." His voice grew stronger, as if speaking truth gave him strength. "Some of you come from places where people said you couldn't succeed. Some of you speak languages that others don't understand. Some of you carry burdens no child should carry." Nods around the room. Children recognizing themselves in his words. "But you're here, in this school, with teachers who believe in you, with opportunities waiting for you. And I want you to know something important." He leaned forward slightly, every eye locked on him. "When I'm Ganand, I will be Gana. I want you to remember that a king came to your school. Not because you were rich or famous or powerful, but because you matter. Because your lives have value. Because what you do with your futures will shape this nation more than anything I ever did." Silence. Complete and absolute. "So dream big," Charles said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Work hard. Help each other. And know that even when no one is watching, your life has meaning." He stepped back from the podium. The room erupted in applause. Not polite applause, real applause. Children on their feet. Teachers crying. Mrs. Okonkwo covering her face with her hands. Thomas felt his own throat tighten. He had stood guard at dozens of royal events. Speeches and ceremonies and gatherings of powerful people, but he had never witnessed anything like this. A dying man giving hope to children. A king using his final strength to tell 300 kids from Birmingham that they mattered. After the ribbon cutting, Charles was scheduled to leave immediately. The doctor had been clear. 30 minutes maximum. But Charles moved through the school, visited classrooms, looked at artwork on walls, asked about the library, the science lab, the garden they were planning. The private secretary kept checking his watch, kept making eye contact with the doctor, kept trying to signal that it was time to go. Charles ignored them all. In the library, he found a boy sitting alone, reading while other children played outside. "What are you reading?" Charles asked, settling into a chair beside him. The boy, maybe 12 years old, looked up. "A book about space, about stars and galaxies." "Tell me about it," Charles said. For 10 minutes they sat together, a king and a boy, talking about the universe, about distances too vast to comprehend, about light that travels for years before anyone sees it. "Do you think," the boy asked, "that stars know when their light reaches someone?" Charles smiled. "Sad and beautiful. I don't think they know, but I think it matters anyway. The light reaching someone, that's what matters." The boy nodded, went back to his book. Charles stood slowly, touched the boy's shoulder once, then walked away. Outside, the motorcade waited, the security team ready, the schedule completely destroyed. Thomas helped the king into the car. Up close, he could see the toll this day had taken. The gray pallor of Charles's skin, the tremor in his hands, the exhaustion radiating from him, but he could also see something else. Peace. Purpose. The look of a man who had spent his energy on something that mattered, as the car pulled away. Children lined the windows, waving, shouting, some crying. Charles waved back, kept waving until they couldn't see him anymore. Then he closed his eyes and leaned back against the seat. "Your Majesty," the doctor began. "You shouldn't have, I know," Charles said quietly. "But I'm glad I did." And in that moment, Thomas understood. This wasn't about should or shouldn't. This wasn't about what was safe or wise or medically advisable. This was about a man choosing how to spend the days he had left, choosing purpose over comfort, connection over rest, choosing to matter right up until the end. April came to London with unexpected warmth. The cherry blossoms bloomed early in the palace gardens, pink and white against blue sky, beautiful and brief. King Charles sat in his wheelchair beneath the trees. His doctor had finally won that battle. No more long walks. No more standing for hours, but he was still working, still meeting people, still serving. Thomas stood nearby, not in full ceremonial uniform today, just watching, guarding. The king had requested him specifically. The young guardsman from that rainy day in February, he had said, "I want him here." Charles sat with a notebook in his lap, writing letters, personal letters to people he had met over the past months. To Ella in the hospital, to Robert, the veteran, to Amara, who wanted to be a doctor. "Your Majesty," the private secretary approached carefully. "There's a request. A documentary crew. They want to film your final weeks for history." Charles looked up, considered. "No, sir. It would be no," Charles repeated gently. "This isn't about history. This is about living." He went back to his letters. Thomas watched him write. Slow, careful movements. Each word an effort. Each sentence a gift. This was what the world didn't see. The quiet moments. The private acts of care. The king writing to a child he'd met once, telling her to keep being brave. A week later, Thomas stood guard outside the king's private chapel. Inside, Charles met with faith leaders, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist. All had come at his request. "I don't know how much time I have," Thomas heard him say, "but I want to use it to bring people together, not divide them." They prayed together, each in their own way. Different words, different traditions, same hope. When they emerged, one of the imams had tears on his face. "He asked us to help each other after he's gone," the man said, "to remember that we're all serving the same values: compassion, justice, love." Thomas thought about his grandfather again, about the coal miner who had never met a king but understood the same truth. Life wasn't about how long you lived. It was about what you gave. In late April, the palace made an announcement. The king would make one final public appearance, a service at St. Paul's Cathedral, a celebration of service and dedication. The nation held its breath. On the day, thousands lined the streets, silent, respectful, holding signs and flowers. Thomas was part of the honor guard, standing at attention as the king's car approached the cathedral. When Charles emerged, the crowd gasped. He had deteriorated visibly, thin, frail, moving with painful slowness. But he was here, present, showing up one more time. Inside the cathedral, he sat in the front row. The service honored people who had dedicated their lives to others: teachers, nurses, social workers, volunteers, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. When it came time for the NZ to speak, he walked to the pulpit, refused the wheelchair. Each step measured, determined. Thomas watched from his position, saw the supreme effort it took, saw the king's hands gripping the pulpit to stay upright. "Service," Charles began, his voice carrying through the ancient cathedral, "is the rent we pay for living on this earth." He paused, gathered breath. "I have tried to pay my rent, have tried to serve, but I stand before you today knowing that I am the one who has been served. He looked out at the gathered people, at the teachers and nurses and volunteers who had given their lives to others. You are the true nobility of this nation, not because of titles or crowns, but because you choose every day to show up for people who need you, to stand when standing is hard, to serve when service costs something. His voice wavered, but he continued. When I am gone, please remember this. Your work matters. Your kindness matters. Every small act of service ripples out into the world in ways you'll never see. He gripped the pulpit harder. Thomas saw his knuckles go white. I have been blessed to be your king, but all of you have taught me what it really means to reign, to rule with compassion, to lead through service, to understand that power means nothing if it doesn't lift others up. It was fading. Everyone could see it. Thank you, he whispered, for letting me serve you. Cathedral was silent. Then, slowly, people stood, one by one, row by row, until everyone was on their feet, not applauding, just standing, bearing witness, honoring a king who had chosen to spend his final energy honoring them. Charles stepped back from the pulpit. Thomas saw him waver, saw the moment his legs began to give out. Thomas moved. Training took over. He was there in seconds, supporting the king's arm. Their eyes met. Charles smiled, weak but genuine. Thank you, guardsman, he whispered. My honor, your majesty. Together, they walked back to the seat, the king leaning on the young guard, the guard holding steady, and in that moment, the symbolism was perfect. The old and the young, the dying and the living, the king and the servant, supporting each other, serving each other as it had always been, as it would always be. 3 weeks later, on a quiet morning in May, King Charles III died peacefully in his sleep. The nation mourned. Flags lowered to half-mast. The bells of Westminster tolled. People gathered at palace gates with flowers and tears, but they also told stories about a king who visited sick children, who sat with veterans, who opened schools in poor neighborhoods, who wrote personal letters to people whose names history would forget, but whose lives he had touched. Thomas stood guard one final time. At the lying-in state, thousands passed by the coffin, paying respects. Saying goodbye, an elderly woman stopped near Thomas. She looked at the coffin, then at the young guard standing watch. He never stopped serving, she said quietly, right up to the end. Thomas nodded. Couldn't speak, couldn't break protocol, but she understood. She patted his arm gently. Thank you for standing guard. For all of you who stand guard, we see you too. She moved on. But her words stayed. That night after his shift, Thomas walked through the palace gardens. The cherry blossoms were gone now. Their brief beauty faded, but the trees remained, strong, waiting for another spring. He thought about the king, about Ella and Robert and Amara and Hassan, about all the lives touched by one man, who refused to let illness define his final chapter. Charles had shown them something profound. That dignity wasn't about avoiding death. It was about choosing how you lived while dying. About serving others even when you could barely serve yourself. About standing. Even when standing was the hardest thing in the world. Thomas straightened his shoulders, looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, light that had traveled vast distances to reach him, and he understood what he would carry forward, what every person who had witnessed the king's final months would carry. The knowledge that service was sacred, that showing up mattered, that every act of kindness, every moment of presence, every choice to stand for something larger than yourself, it all mattered, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching, because that's when it meant the most. Thomas walked back toward the palace, past the empty guard posts that would be filled again tomorrow, past the windows where lights were dimming for the night, past the gates where flowers were piled 10 feet high. He would stand guard again, would serve again, would show up again, because that's what you did. That's what the king had taught them all. You showed up. You served. You stood until you couldn't stand anymore. And then you stood anyway. That was loyalty. That was honor. That was love. And somewhere, in a hospital bed, Ella was getting stronger. In a veteran's home, Robert was telling younger residents about the day the king came to visit. In Birmingham, Amara was studying to be a doctor. The king was gone, but his service remained, rippling outward, touching lives he would never know. Light traveling through darkness, reaching people, always Mar, and young guards like Thomas would stand watch over that legacy, would protect not just palaces and protocol, but something far more precious. The belief that every life has value, that service is sacred, that showing up right up to the end is the truest form of nobility any person can achieve. King or commoner, young or old, healthy or dying, we all stand guard over something. The question is, what will we choose to protect? Charles had made his choice, and in doing so, had shown them all how to make theirs.